Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. As Keith has just said, I'm David Rutland. I'm part of the I'm part of DECC actually, but part of the Office of Carbon Capture and Storage within DECC. I always think the title of Head of Market Development sounds one of these really obscure phrases that no one quite knows what they're doing, including me, I've got to say sometimes. But essentially, there are sort of four big chunks to what I'm interested in on a sort of day-to-day basis. As already mentioned, many of you know that the department is going through a quite a radical reform of the electricity market, and I'll talk a bit about that later on. One of my interests is ensuring that reform incorporates the needs of CCS in particular. So that's quite a big part of my job. I also deal with our policy on infrastructure, by which I guess we mean pipelines and storage, and to the extent that we get involved also in EOR, which is why I'm here as well. And obviously in doing that we work closely with Jonathan Thomas, who I think you heard from yesterday. Completely unrelated to CCS, I also deal with our policy in relation to unabated gas and coal generation, and in particular the challenge that the reform to the electricity market poses to those, and also rather bizarrely our coal production as well, and yes, there is still some. So that's my little rag bag, and as I say, it keeps me busy. What I'm really going to cover today are three things. I want to describe a bit of context for you, so why CCS is actually important from a government perspective, because it's not necessarily obvious that it should be, but why CCS is important. What the government's doing to actually help facilitate the development of CCS, and we think that we're doing quite a lot. Quite a lot of other people think we're not doing nearly enough, but and also that sort of towards the end a bit about the potential synergy as we see it between CCS and EOR. Couple of sort of things to start with. I will constantly say EOR. I'm afraid in the world that I work in the environment I come from, we talk about EOR, but what we really mean is CO2 EOR. So give me that leeway. And I think the other thing to say as a sort of precursor to what I'm going to say is that from a CCS perspective, EOR is a bit of a nirvana. It's sort of the thing that is going to make CCS happen and be cost effective. I think that you may sense an element of that also in what I'm going to say, but please don't interpret that as a sort of misunderstanding of the challenges that would be faced with CO2 EOR, particularly in an offshore environment. So, having said that, and we've got my apologies out of the way. First, a bit of background as to why we think CCS is important. And I think the first point I'd make is that it's quite important to appreciate that the government's interest in CCS is driven almost entirely by our climate change objectives. So if you look at some countries around the world and some regions around the world that are interested in promoting CCS, quite often you'll see that they have some interest in novel hydrocarbons. They may have an interest. They may have a big coal generation sector, for instance. None of that really applies in the UK context. So the interest is really about how we can use CCS to deliver on our climate change targets, which are quite significant. And I think the other point to bear in mind that sort of as we speak, the UK, despite the progress that we're making on renewables and decarbonising electricity supply, the UK remains really very heavily dependent on fossil fuels. That chart in where is it? That one here is quite old now, but it gives you a sense of how much we rely on fossil fuels. I think coal and gas account for about 66%. In May of this year, actually, the proportion was 60%. Actually, I checked yesterday, and it was much lower than that, but mainly because quite a lot of the coal stations are not generating at the moment. The other thing I think that drives our thinking on CCS is that there's a sort of acknowledgement that fossil fuels aren't going away. And if you want to deliver a low carbon economy and have the benefit of using fossil fuels, particularly for electricity generation, then you've really got no option in relation to CCS. You have to demonstrate that technology as a commercially viable technology. I think probably the only other point worth mentioning is that based on our analysis, we think the importance of coal as a generation technology will obviously decline over time as climate change and other environmental measures begin to take effect. But that decline is going to be over quite a long period. Certainly, we're talking about the next 10 to 15 years at least, as coal still having a significant impact in UK generation. So, yep, still there. So the reason that we're interested, it may seem obvious, but the reason that as a government we're interested in CCS is because it provides us with a potential route to cost-effective decarbonisation. This graphic on the right here, the circled figures there are essentially, you won't be able to read them, but the circled figures there are various costs of various forms of fossil fuel electricity generation, including with CCS installed and not. And I mean, you can argue about the value of some of these numbers, but I think the point is that, and these are what are expected to be the levelised costs. But the significance of this is that if you compare them with the alternatives, they're in the same sort of ballpark. So it's actually worth investing in bringing this technology to maturity. I've got to say that at the moment, we are nowhere near these costs in terms of the predicted costs of CCS for electricity generation. There was some work done last year by the CCS Cost Reduction Task Force, which I'll mention later, but I think that estimated a sort of cost at the moment of about £160 per megawatt hour, which is sort of 50% on top of what that is there. But I think that chart is quite important because it demonstrates that, providing we can get to the point of commercial viability, then these technologies can play an important role in electricity generation. If we didn't think that was the case, we wouldn't think there was any case for actually developing CCS or trying to facilitate the development of CCS. I think the other point as well I'd like to make here is that ETI Energy Technologies did some work, again about a year, 18 months ago, where they estimated that the sort of potential benefit of having CCS available as a carbon abatement technology as you decarbonise the economy amounted to about 1% of GDP, which is an incredible number really, and it's obviously that's because of its utilisation for much more than electricity generation. It's the impact of decarbonising other bits of the economy as well. So, a bit about what we're doing on CCS and why we're doing it. The chart up here sort of describes the 5 aspects for our programme, and I'll talk about most of these in a bit more detail as we go through. But the bit that attaches all the headlines is the commercialisation programme. £1 billion capital funding. I'll give a sort of quick update of where that stands a bit in a minute or so. We're also investing quite a lot as government in R&D and an innovation programme to support much earlier stage research in CCS, and again I'll describe a bit about that. Probably as important as anything is the work we're doing to reform the electricity market in order to make it, frankly, more cost and competitive to invest in low carbon forms of generation than forms of generation which emit larger amounts of carbon dioxide. We're also done quite a lot of work and quite mainly finished now to actually create the sort of regulatory environment in the UK that enables CCS projects to develop. When I first came to CCS, which was about 10 years ago or so now, I hate to say, so it probably doesn't quite put me in the category of an Austin Allegro, but I feel that way sometimes. But but we did quite a lot of work to look at the regulatory barriers to deploying CCS, and did quite an extensive program to remove all of those. We also engaged quite a lot internationally, with particularly with the countries that are primarily interested in CCS, like the Norwegians, the Australians, the Americans, the Canadians, etc. Just a bit of a plug, really. I mean, I think one of the things that we're quite pleased about is that the sort of policy environment in the UK generally is regarded as one of the best anywhere for investing in CCS. I mean, that's what we want to achieve, and a number of sort of independent organisations have sort of said that. Most recently, the Global CCS Institute. So that's the end of the plugs. Said I'd mention the competition. It's a bit of our approach that gets most of the headlines, and it's really the cornerstone of what we're doing. We're making available £1 billion of capital. We're also providing revenue support through a contract for difference, basically a supplement to the price of electricity that these generators can earn in the marketplace. It's progressing well. We've got 2 projects which are currently in detailed design, so they're currently in FEED. That's going to take about 2 years to reach completion. And what we're hoping for is at the end of that 2 years, government and the various parties involved will be sufficiently confident of the costs and deliverability of those projects that we can conclude that we as government and the developers as investors in the project as well can feel confident to make a final investment decision in those projects. And the intention is to try and have these projects operational by 2018, I believe. A bit more detail about the 2 competitions. You may have seen some of this already. There are 2. The first is the White Rose project. It's a consortium involving Alstom, involving DREX, BOC, National Grid Carbon, new coal-fired power station, and storage is expected to be in the southern North Sea. At the moment, I believe the intention is to store the carbon dioxide in an aquifer. The other is the Peterhead project in Scotland, led by Shell. This is on an existing gas-fired power station at Peterhead, and storage is going to be offshore in the Golden Eye depleted gas field. Horrible picture. But really just to say, I mentioned earlier that we're spending money on R&D. It's a collaborative effort really between a number of different public bodies, including the research councils, organisations like the Energy Technologies Institute, as well as DECC. I think, as far as I could see at least, there's nothing here which is directly targeted at CO2 EOR. But if you sort of analyse the blocks, there's about a third of it which is in related areas like storage and monitoring and transport. And one of the things that's come out of this is the sort of UK SAP database, which identifies 600 potential storage sites in the UK offshore area, which the Crown Estate, I think you're hearing from later on today, and BGS are currently developing further. I mentioned earlier that one of the things that we're doing as a government, and this doesn't apply specifically to CCS, is that we're essentially changing the way in which the electricity market works in order to give preference to investment in low carbon generation. It's not quite how we put it, but that's essentially what the point is. the two key mechanisms, EMR is quite a complicated beast, but there are two key mechanisms really that will impact on CCS. One is the introduction of contract for differences, which are essentially premium payments that electricity suppliers of low carbon electricity, including CCS, will receive, and will be one of the means of rewarding the projects that are mentioned that are part of our commercialisation programme. And the other is a capacity market, which is essentially intended to encourage sufficient investment in gas generation to ensure that we don't run into any electricity or security of supply problems. Probably worth recognising that in addition to this sort of mechanistic reform of the electricity market, there's also a substantial financial commitment behind that. So if you look at the amount of money the government was spending on encouraging investment in low carbon generation in 2012-2013, it was about £2.5 billion. The intention is to triple that by 2020. So there'll be 7.6 billion available to support investment in low carbon generation in 2020, as I say, 3 times that was being spent in 2013. And that really is having an effect in stimulating the market, both for CCS and other technologies. So I think I would say that there's an opportunity for CCS there, and if there's an opportunity for CCS there, then there's probably an opportunity for CCS EOR there as well. But in order for that to happen, CCS really needs to be demonstrated as a commercially viable and competitive technology compared with other low carbon forms of generation. That chart to the right here summarises some work that was done by the CCS Cost Reduction Task Force last year. And their conclusion was that there is clear potential for CCS to be cost competitive with other low carbon forms of generation, by which they mean sort of around about the £100 per megawatt hour mark, and in the early 2020s. But in order to achieve that, one of the key things is to secure sort of critical investment in a critical mass of infrastructure. I think the infrastructure is the blue block there, and that, or maybe the red block actually. But that really is a key part of trying to achieve the cost competitiveness of CCS. The Cost Reduction Task Force also noted the sort of cost benefit of EOR for CCS. They sort of acknowledged that benefit was uncertain, but they thought it might, if you could combine CCS with EOR, then you would potentially reduce the cost by about another 5 to 12 megawatts an hour for gas, and about 10 to 26 megawatts per hour for coal. So clearly quite an important additional means of reducing the cost of CCS and therefore increasing its deployability. So I think one of the points I want to get over is that sort of CCS and EOR can be mutually beneficial techniques, recognising that there's sort of an uncertainty attached with both of them that makes the actual realisation of that benefit quite difficult. I mean, from a CCS perspective, it provides a sort of key cost reduction option for CCS by monetising what is essentially otherwise a waste product. It sort of should help to aid the development of investment and infrastructure required for CCS. It negates the sort of expensive, time-consuming, and actually quite risky process of trying to validate offshore aquifer storage sites, which is the sort of alternative if you don't use depleted oil and gas fields. And the production of petroleum obviously puts less dependence on oil inputs and increases UK energy security. It from oil and gas production perspective, it sort of delays decommissioning costs if those assets can be used for alternative purposes. And one of the things that as a government we did 2 or 3 years ago now was to make it easier for assets that are going to be used for CCS to delay their decommissioning obligations to enable that to happen. That required some primary legislation that we implemented. And as I said before, I mean, I think so. From a CCS perspective, this you know, if we can bring off a connection between CCS and EOR, then there's considerable benefit. I think the other point that I'd quite like to get over really is that whilst we sort of understand and appreciate that CO2 EOR, particularly offshore, is quite unique. The EOR as a technology is obviously not obviously not a particularly novel activity. In the US, it's been commercial scale application for the last 30 years. Actually, in the US onshore, my impression is that CO2 availability is quite often the major constraint in terms of the ability to do more EOR. Recognising in particular in the US that the development of CO2 infrastructure in particular has been built on the availability of natural CO2 rather than anthropogenic CO2, but nevertheless there's still quite a lot there. They're using about 60 million tonnes of carbon dioxide at the moment, about 1,500 miles of pipeline available. Last substantive slide really is about what the CCS programme could mean in terms of availability of carbon dioxide. Obviously, the amount of carbon dioxide, the amount of CO2 that's available for storage in EOR will depend on the rate of deployment of CCS. There are various scenarios for the deployment of CCS, and they have quite a lot of variability attached to them. But if you look at one of the things, the government's most recent planning in terms of electricity supply suggested there might be a contribution from CCS to electricity generation by 2030 of up to 83 terawatt hours, which is about 13 gigawatts of installed capacity, and it's about equivalent to about 50 million tons of carbon dioxide. All of that carbon dioxide will have to be stored offshore, and most of it will be stored in geology, which is quite close to geology that's used for oil and gas production. There are some higher figures than that too. There are some lower figures, but there are some higher figures of that too. The Energy Technologies Institute estimates that we would need to store up to, I think it's 200 million tonnes by 2030. Once you build in the need to decarbonise industry as well as the electricity generation sector. So in summary, what I'd like to say is that we think that CO2 EOR has an important role to play, an important potential role to play in the development of CCS, and we also think CCS can help the implementation of EOR by bringing CO2 offshore where it can be used to extend the life of mature fields. We recognise that that's all far from straightforward, but I think our view is, if nothing else, is that unless we sort of start to actively explore that potential and start to do that fairly quickly, then we will never make progress. And that's all I want to say. Thank you.